Hello, everyone. Let's talk a little bit about economic growth and growth of the economy. You think would be pretty straightforward. Obviously, economic growth would be shown by higher levels of GDP, um, higher income levels, higher unemployment, or excuse me, higher employment, that sort of thing. The economy just going up. Well, if you thought that way, you would it would be very logical. It would make sense, and it would be wrong. So we're going to talk about exactly what economic growth is in the view of the economists, and show you a few things here. Now, economic growth is actually the growth of the potential, the productive capacity of the economy. Now, why do we say that? Well, if remember how the economy grows, that there are cyclical fluctuations in the, got to be careful when you say that. So if we have real GDP, and potential on this axis, and we have time over here. What do we see over time? Well, the potential or the capacity of the economy to produce when it's running on full cylinders looks like this. It goes up at an increasing rate. It will go up at an increasing rate, or what is called an exponential increase, because if it even grows at 3%, if the capacity grows at 3% per year, say there's a sum that grows 3% the first year, well, that grown sum will grow another 3% in the next year. And then that sum will grow 3% also. So we have basically the growth of potential here growing at an increasing rate. Potential GDP, okay? Now, what about when we take a look at the actual GDP numbers over time? Well, we see kind of a interesting phenomenon here. Let's say that is 1920. We'll start her out there. That was a big year or a big period in the economy. 1940, 50, 60, and then let's kind of break things up here and go to 2008, and then on up to our time. Okay. Well, if the red is the actual numbers, we'll see that the potential, the real GDP, very closely follows the potential GDP. And so this shows that the economy usually, excuse me, the economy usually is running on all cylinders. Now, what about how would the Great Depression look here? Say the Great Depression started about this time. We see that in the World War I eras, the economy actually grew for a short time more than the potential. And then here during the Great Depression, it dipped. It increased during World War II. The Vietnam War, it increased a little bit and had inflationary concerns. The price index, the war on inflation that was pretty big at that time was like that. And then say at 2008 when we had the Great Recession, not a depression, the potential dipped a little bit like that, and it pretty much follows the potential of the economy, something like that. Okay, so why do we say the economic growth is the potential and not the real? Well, remember how the numbers, the GDP figures, tend to be cyclical. And why do they tend to be cyclical? Well, let's talk about that just a little bit. Now, if we were to zoom in on this curve that we just drew, you would find that the potential is going like this, and the actual numbers are sort of moving like that. There are peaks and troughs, and there are recessions and expansions or recoveries, and it is like that. Well, another way that we could illustrate this is, remember when the red dipped below, when the actual numbers were below the blue number, the potential there. Well, let's illustrate this on the basis of our aggregate demand and aggregate supply that we talked about here. So we have here, let's say, we have the average price level, or what is the, now what do you call that? Implicit price deflator there. And you have real GDP here. Okay. And you have the, let's say, the long run aggregate supply, just like that. Okay. And you have aggregate demand that maybe looks something like that. Aggregate demand. Then where the short run aggregate supply curve is determines where the actual numbers, how close they are to the potential. So what would you think if the short run aggregate supply intersected here? And again, remember that the long run aggregate supply, the time frame is long enough that the economy completely accounts for and responds fully to any changing economic circumstance. In the short run aggregate supply, it doesn't, because prices are sticky. Prices do not change as quickly as they do on a micro, on the micro supply and demand diagram that we saw. But where we have a situation like this, where the current equilibrium between the short run aggregate supply, the aggregate demand is below the potential. The long run aggregate supply, we can think of it as the potential GDP. Okay. And if there is a situation where the actual current equilibrium is less than the potential, okay, I'll say actually GDP right here, we have what's called a recessionary gap. Okay, the economy is not hitting on all cylinders. So if we have something like that in that other diagram, where we had the potential economy and time and we had GDP potential, real and potential, we would have a situation where the potential was going up like that, but the real was actually down here somewhere. Okay. So what would the government do generally? Well, they would put into effect an expansionary policies that would increase aggregate demand to move it to a position out here. And where it did that, right there, the actual numbers would hit again the potential. Okay. So, why are the actual numbers not a sign of economic growth? Well, if a higher level, when they solve or when they work on this recessionary gap and it moves out like that and it reaches its potential, it's just a fluctuation in the economy. On the other hand, if that was a sign of economic growth, if we had the other situation here, let's say we had an inflationary gap, okay? So that would be a situation where the aggregate demand would be like that, and the short run aggregate supply would be something like that. And so the gap would be above potential. And the government would probably implement a contractionary policy to lower aggregate demand, cool off the economy so that it moved back to here. Okay. When they do that and the economy cools off a little bit, is that if the equilibrium GDP, real GDP level increases, if we said that was economic growth, we'd have to say a situation where the government meant to shift downward aggregate demand to cure inflation. We'd have to say the economy shrunk, and it didn't. It was just a fluctuation. Okay, this is the same thing as a peak in a valley. Remember in the situation here, if we see the time and we see the actual numbers, this is the potential growth of the economy. What we will see are things like this. The ones above the potential would be a situation like that. And the dips or the recessions and the troughs would be below the potential. But they're just fluctuations. The real growth of the economy is in the growth of the potential. And this next one we'll talk about exactly how that happens and how we would look at that graphically. So thank you for your kind attention, and a word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back.